As you can imagine, trying to cover this topic in the space of 10 minutes is going to be difficult, but that's what we're going to attempt to do. The Holocaust was the mass destruction of the Jews from, well, some people dispute when it started. Some people will say it started in 1938 with Kristallnacht. Others will say that it did in fact begin with a meeting in Wannsee in Berlin in January 1942. There was a special meeting called in January 1942 at Wannsee in Berlin, and at that meeting, present at that meeting was Heydrich. Heydrich was Himmler's second in command. Heydrich was his deputy. Heydrich was a big figure in the Waffen-SS, and in fact he was responsible at that time for looking after Czechoslovakia, and particularly Bohemia and Moravia, and he was based in Prague. He was called to Berlin for this meeting in January 1942, and the purpose of that meeting was to outline something that would become known as the final solution to the Jewish question. And that is something that was actually written into the minutes of this meeting. And the final solution to the Jewish question would involve killing them all. The debate was how to kill them all. And that was something that was discussed at length in this meeting. So you had representatives from the transport sector from Germany and also from the occupied territories to discuss how this is going to happen. You had scientists there. You had lots of different people who were contributing to this discussion. And it was decided that at this meeting that gas, or the use of poison gas, Zyklon B, the chemical Zyklon B, would be used to kill the Jews. And there were different reasons for that. From July 1941, if we go over here, from the summer of 1941, Germany had invaded Russia, as we know. Germany had invaded Russia, and there were massive gains to be made at the beginning of this period. The German army advanced massively into large swathes of Russia and the Ukraine. In fact, Ukraine was totally occupied. Now, that advance was made by the German army, but behind the German army was the Einsatzgruppen. The Einsatzgruppen were mobile killing squads. They were assigned, ultimately, to kill as many Jews as possible, and that didn't matter whether they were women or children. Their job was very simple. Go in there, follow the army, round up men, women and children, Jews from nearby villages, and to execute them. And the main method was by shooting them. Now, the Nazis realised that, these two are actually linked, because the Nazis realised that this process of killing, it was in their view wasting ammunition, and the second one was that the soldiers who were committing these executions, some of them were encountering psychological problems. It doesn't matter, how hard a Nazi you are. If you're shooting someone face to face and it's perhaps a baby or a young child, there are going to be psychological ramifications. So a lot of these soldiers were struggling with that, and the Nazi solution to this was the use of gas. Because if they're in a gas chamber and the door's closed, all the Germans have to do, and one of them can do it, is to pour the gas into the top. They don't have to look while people are dying. They don't have to watch it. And then they can actually get the Jews to clear up afterwards. The Nazis much favoured this solution to the problem rather than the use of just killing them with bullets and shooting them. It was far too messy for them. So this was the solution. This was the final solution to that problem. Why did the final solution come about at this time? Well, some of that is linked to the war itself. For example, in December 1941, the USA entered the war, and the Germans realised that if they were going to, or certainly the SS realised that if they were going to eradicate the Jews, they'd better speed up a little bit, because once the Americans enter the European war, things are going to get a little bit more difficult for them. Also, it was necessity. They'd occupied massive swathes of Russian land. So they had huge amounts of Jews had come into their control. For example, in Poland, there were 3.3 million Jews in 1939. Poland was under the control of the Nazis. Other countries had big populations of Jews. The Ukraine had big populations. In Russia itself, there were lots of Jews. So all of these Jews needed to do something with them. They couldn't put them all into concentration camps. There simply wasn't the space for that. So their solution was to kill them. And so they realised that was one way of dealing with the numbers that they now had under their control. And I suppose the final one is Hitler himself. Hitler, we know about Hitler's beliefs. We know that he was incredibly anti-Semitic in his views. We know that one of his missions set down in Mein Kampf was to kill all the Jews, was to eradicate international Jews. So, so that fit in really with his mission. So when the Einsatzgruppen went into Russia and they were doing all this, they realised that this was a better way. And from 1941-42 onwards, camps started to be built. And these were death camps. The death camps had special gas chambers in them, and that was the big difference between death camps and concentration camps. Although some of those facilities were fitted to concentration camps much later on in the war. But at this time, the concentration camps were slave labour camps. Death camps were going to be killing factories. That's what the death camps were going to be. They were going to be killing factories. One famous example of a death camp would be Auschwitz. But you had others like Kelmo and Treblinka. And these camps were built in Poland. And there was a reason for that. And the reason is just here. That actually the most amount of Jews were in Poland. So if the Nazis were gonna execute them, then it made sense to put the death camps close to where the biggest population of Jews was. And that was really why that decision was made. The Auschwitz opened in the middle of 1942. And it immediately set to work. Train tracks were built. There was a massive rail network that was created just so Jews could be transported from occupied countries as far as France, Holland, Greece. Any Nazi-occupied territory would have its Jews extracted and sent by railway to Auschwitz or one of these other camps here. And that's really where the killing of Jews really started to accelerate. Now, the most, I suppose, common kind of thing that you always learn about when you look at the Holocaust would be what actually happened when they got to the camps. So on arrival at Auschwitz, for example, there would be a selection. And there would be a selection between the fit to work and the unfit to work. Now, this was awful in the sense that a lot of the people who were unfit to work were either the old or the very young. A 6-year-old girl, for example, is going to have limited capacity to work. A 70, 80-year-old woman is going to have a limited capacity to work. So the fit were often the middle-aged, perhaps young men, mid-20s, young men who could do the slave labour. Because in Auschwitz there were two parts to the camp. There was the death camp facility, but also the standard concentration camp. Eventually, everyone in the standard concentration camp would be killed anyway. But first of all, you've got this selection. If you survive the selection, you go to the camp. If you don't survive the selection, so over here, you would go straight to the gas chamber. Before entering the gas chamber, you'd obviously have all your hair cut off. They would extract your jewellery. If you had any false teeth, they'd pull those out. Shoes, belts, bags that you've actually brought from wherever you've come from. All of your possessions would be taken away. You would go into the gas chamber completely naked. They would pour the Zyklon B chemical in there. They would close the gas chamber off, and you would be dead. Sometimes it was quick. Other times it could take 10 minutes for the gas to actually kill you. And that's what would happen on arrival. If you were fit, you would go to work. So that would be slave labour. Otto Frank would be a good example, not in Auschwitz, but Otto Frank was the example of somebody who, at that time, Frank's dad, who went to the camp and got put onto work detail. And that's one of the reasons he actually survived the Holocaust, because he stayed healthy, he stayed fit, he managed to keep his head, whereas others were not so fortunate and were actually sent to the gas chambers. This process went on really from 1942 to 1945, and in fact, in the last year of the war, that's when most of them were executed, which is incredible if you think of the resources that the Nazis were putting into that, even when the war was essentially lost. And just coming back over here, because they were being killed, and quite often it's a case of where they were coming from. So the main centres they were coming from were ghettos. A ghetto was an enclosed area in a town or city where Jews would be walled in and forced to live. There would be a lack of gas and electricity. There would be a lack of food. There would be a lack of supplies. There would be 10 Jewish people living in one room. So there was a famous ghetto in Warsaw in Poland. There was a famous ghetto in Budapest. And there were lots of ghettos all across occupied Europe, but particularly in the east of Europe. So that's where, sometimes they would liquidate the ghetto, which essentially involved making space, because some of these ghettos got so crowded that the Nazis had to make space for new Jews. So they did that by literally going in there and kidnapping, 100,000 or whatever the number might be, putting them on trains to the death camps where they would be executed. So this whole process that you can see on the board now was responsible for killing an estimated 6 million Jews, although some people dispute that number and actually put it closer to 8 million Jews that were killed in this process. So there are mixed views on how many were actually killed, but the bottom line is it was a Holocaust. It was the mass destruction of the Jews, and it was done in a frightfully efficient way.